a lawn mowing business in junior high and high school. I'd ride around with my little powered lawnmower and a skateboard, go around in the neighborhood. And so that was a super fun business. I wish I had just kept running it. But I went off to college down in San Diego. I will say I got really interested in microfinance. We can maybe talk about that more. I think that's actually how I got to know Andrew and seeing how can I help other people start their businesses and get them access to capital through college and post. That was my first job out of college, was actually doing micro lending. So that gave me a chance to sort of watch and get to interact with, consult with tons and tons of different business owners and know that that was eventually going to be my path. I did went back to business school after working for about 5 years. I went to University of Washington, did an MBA, and um, really in that time was started to evaluate, oh, would I want to be a owner of a tech company, like a super high growth VC backed type of company. And so I spent a year with an angel investing group and got to be on the side of evaluating entrepreneurs, evaluating pitches, and helping the angel group to decide who would they invest in. So I got to see a few different angles of it growing up. And it wasn't about 5 years ago. I didn't go right into entrepreneurship at that time. I went into management consulting with Accenture and spent 5 years as a management consultant. And ultimately, in my last year there, was getting tour base going, and finally made the jump 5 years ago or actually officially 4 years ago now, to tour base. And that's a little bit of, I guess, the journey of how I got to be what I'm doing today.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, so this is a coincidence, but Travis, Jannine, and I all have micro lending as a common thread in our careers. So that's pretty cool. Travis, I don't know if you knew that, and Jannine, I don't know if you knew that about the other one, but yeah,
I did not.
that's how Jannine and I met too. So yeah, Jannine, why don't I turn it over to you and we'll hear your story.
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm Jannine Versi, co-founder and CEO of a women's health company called Electra Health, and have had a varied and not non-linear route, I think, to where we are today. There are definitely some motifs, it sounds like, including um, the microfinance commonality. But my first sort of I didn't do what Travis did. I didn't kind of run my own company early on, but I was in college at the University of Pennsylvania, and I was studying humanities. I was always a humanities lover, and I took a job, like a part-time job in the evenings with a company called Insomnia Cookies, which was a startup run by a couple of students. I don't know who here has had Insomnia Cookies, but the theme or the idea was that you could get hot, fresh cookies and brownies delivered to you until like 2 or 3 in the morning. And so I was a baker my freshman year of college, and it was kind of, not doing anything productive between the hours of 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. most nights anyway. And so I was like, making very little cash, but kind of just fell in love with how fun it was to be doing all these different things. Like I remember I had this one of my tasks was to like find better packaging. So we ended up getting like pizza boxes that we rebranded and redesigned for cookies. And it just was so much fun to work on something that felt so tangible. Like the work that you did that day would result in something being different, the next day or the next week. And again, like I was studying, history and politics and economics, and I think that's part of what led me to the microfinance space. But it was like a totally different experience to what I'd had before. Most of my jobs prior had been like working in restaurants and stuff like that. So fast forward, I was at Penn, which has an undergraduate business school, and I was not at Wharton, the undergraduate business school, but I had a lot of friends that were there and were going into this like investment banking path, and kind of were like, maybe you should look into this for an internship. And so I I dutifully like did that, and I ended up getting an investment banking internship, and it was really, really good training. Just in terms of like how to operate in a workplace. But I quickly figured out that like I was like really bad at finance and still not great at it, as it turns out. But it was you know, I think then the microfinance thing evolved as this way that it spoke to the entrepreneurial side, and it had the sort of international development side, and there was this, you know, direct tie to the idea of capital markets, which I do believe in and did believe in. Fast forward a number of years, I ended up spending some time at Google, and that was like early 2009, 10, and it was Facebook was a startup, and you know, it was kind of this era of the internet when we didn't have Instagram yet. And so had a little bit of experience in the tech space. And then when I was in business school, I went to Harvard. I was seeing the healthcare sector evolving with Obamacare and the ACA, and had this experience in tech. And so was really looking for like the intersection of those things. And that's when I really started focusing on healthcare. I ended up going actually to DC and working in the Obama administration in a sort of different capacity, but always with a view to, you know, that's a public service opportunity that's going to end. It was the end of the second term. And so I'm going to do this for a couple of years, and then I'm going to come back to the startup space, and really specifically in healthcare and tech. And so worked at a couple of different digital health startups. Both like teeny tiny, brand new, a couple that didn't work out, and then one that did very well and is doing well, called City Block Health, and I was pretty early there. And then after a couple of years there, sort of saw this opportunity in the women's health space, and left to go and found Electra. So we focus on women's health specifically in the midlife years. So we tend to say in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and some of our patients are in their 70s. Pretty different phase of life than what women's health can entail in the earlier, and pretty overlooked. So it's changing happily, but I'm happy to dig in more about that. But bit of a winding journey, nevertheless.
Yeah, as most interesting careers are. Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing, both of you. And I would like to get into more specifics about what your companies do, but first I would love, I think because this panel is about transitioning to entrepreneurship, I'd love to kind of go back in time and try and get in your heads from that place where you were making a decision about jumping in. Like, what were you thinking? What were the risks you were, considering? What was exciting? I'd love to hear, or maybe let's start with like, when was the first moment where you're like, I know that I want to be an entrepreneur? Like Travis mentioned that the lawn mowing, but like, what about like in the serious adult phase where you're like, I think I actually want to do this? So I'd love for either of you to jump in if you have a specific memory of that, and then maybe we can talk a little bit more about the decision-making process after that.
I can say that it kind of in my blood and mind from the get-go, going through college, after college, getting ready to go do an MBA. It was like, okay, can I best position myself to own my own business someday? Because I'm super passionate about the idea of, I think many people like this idea of being their own boss, finding freedom in your schedule, being able to scale something bigger than just sort of trading dollars and hours. All of that resonated, but it just for me was something that I was just constantly kind of positioning for and trying to decide when is the right time. So it's like, okay, not the right time. I want to go get an MBA. I want to keep learning. I want to keep getting more various experiences. During the MBA, I was like, okay, should I take this entrepreneurial path? You can take entrepreneurship and you can get yourself kind of ready to jump into that. And I was like, still feels a little too early because I've kind of got this nonprofit background in microfinance and then jumping into entrepreneurship. What if that doesn't work? And so I also didn't feel like I really understood how big companies worked yet either, because I had seen lots and lots of small business finance and small business consulting. So I kind of stumbled into consulting, not even knowing what consulting was in terms of a career opportunity until I was in business school. And then I got to realize, oh, cool. I get to go and sort of see the inside, look under the hood of the Microsofts and Starbucks and Boeings and all these companies. I was mostly working in the greater Seattle, Pacific Northwest region. So I think for me, it was just constantly kind of trying to feel out like, what can I learn and prepare myself for so I can be as successful as possible. And then trying to start to de-risk the process a little bit of looking at different opportunities. And for me, I was never the I'm going to go found a company person. I was like, I want to buy a company and take that route of entrepreneurship and grow it and use good leadership and business practices and marketing knowledge and see how I can be strategic to grow this thing. So I spent a lot of time just looking at different companies that were for sale in my last couple years at Accenture before I made this jump and thinking I was going to buy a company. And so that was a really, really helpful process too, that I would encourage people to do is just look at existing businesses. You get to, usually sign an NDA and then you get access to all their financial statements and a conversation with the founder and or the existing owner of the company and understand what different businesses and different industries look like. So that was a really fun part of my process of starting to imagine myself even getting closer and closer, or even starting to put a couple offers on the table before I kind of made the jump to what I'm doing today.
Travis, you mentioned de-risking, like besides learning and having more kind of confidence yourself, like what else did you think about when it came to de-risking?
Yeah, I think being able to look at the financials and understand an industry and kind of what competitive factors are out there, right? Okay, so what could make this business go south? What
Mhm,
happens if I only run it 75% as effectively as the people before
mhm.
me? And kind of just doing a little bit of that worst case scenario analysis, which I'll say it's hard to actually convince yourself of worst case scenario. Things can go worse, but it's very easy to be optimistic as an entrepreneur going into entrepreneurship. But yeah, I'd say that's one of them, is really just looking at thinking about
Yeah,
like, okay, how could this go wrong?
yeah,
Do I actually have any sort of competitive advantage in this business?
yeah,
And how much financial cushion is there?
yeah. I wanna respond to that before Jannine goes, because I have at least one business school classmate here, and I took a class with a behavioral finance and negotiation expert, and he said we all have this tendency to be optimistic, especially entrepreneurs. And one way to kind of like counteract that bias that's inherent in our head is to ask that question that you just mentioned, Travis. Like, how could I be wrong? Like you constantly are finding ways to convince yourself that you're right and the way that you see the world is right. It's confirmation bias and whatnot. But if you flip it and say like, how could this go wrong or how could I be wrong? It allows you to view things in a different lens, and often that can be a really productive way to identify your blind spots and identify the risks of a project. So yeah, it's a great call, Travis. Jannine, why don't you hop in and share your experience?
I think that, I like that Travis mentioned the different routes to entrepreneurship. Because I think for me, I did not plan on founding anything. I, described this experience at Insomnia Cookies, and I loved how fast it was and how dynamic it was. And I have worked as a chief of staff in a couple of different jobs, and I have been sort of used to that, like a generalist of generalists and having, sort of visibility and getting to like play in all these different areas. But I didn't have a hankering to be like a founder, to be the first one or the second one. I was sort of like I could be part of that early team, pinch hitting in all these different areas. So at least as it relates, so there was working in startups, which I knew I enjoyed, and you get to be like maybe adjacent to that early entrepreneurial spirit. And then I think for me, the real question of whether I was going to start something and like really put it all on the line, in terms of like, you know, salary and stability, and was after I left City Block, which was then like a Series A to B startup at like 200 people. Great, I had a VP title, I had like a solid set of responsibilities. Um, but I was really curious about what was happening in the women's health space, and I needed like time to step back and start thinking. And I met, so funny how like so much goes back to this, what you did in a prior life, even if it's totally unrelated. So someone that Andrew and I know from the days that we were doing microfinance in India, remained a friend, is in New York as an investor, and he said to me, "You should meet a friend of mine who's interested in women's health." And it was like the most basic introduction. I met her and she was interviewing for co-founder. And I was like, I don't have like, she was non-technical. She is non-technical. And I was like, I'm not a technical founder, just in case that's not clear. Like, I don't bring that wasn't my impression. Was like, there's a business person, there's a technical founder, co-founder. And she was like, no, no, no. Like, I'm really looking for a thought partner and like a partner in the building of the business, not necessarily someone who's like skill complement to me. And the thinking that went into it was like, if this doesn't pan out in a year, I will have like learned something. I called, my friends. I think I talked to you about it, Andrew. I called like other folks I'd worked with. I called my parents. And I had a really long talk with my then brand new husband and was like, all right, how's this going to look? Because we didn't raise any money. We didn't even know what our business model was going to be. Like, I think to be really ruthlessly transparent, it was like, are you cool with me not earning an income and working on this thing for some amount of time? And it would not have been possible if like he wasn't like, yeah, go for it. And if we together weren't like, all right, if this just doesn't pan out, we're confident that, I can like find another job somewhere. So I don't know, I think very practical. And I do think I think unlike a lot of entrepreneurs, maybe like I see all the problems and like all the reasons it'll go wrong. And I have to push myself to be like, no, wait, like don't you're like, don't think about all the ways in which you can fail. Like think about what success might look like. So I think that's just like a little bit of how I'm built. Slightly different.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, and both of you kind of alluded to this, but the financial realities and the risks of starting a company. Jeanine, you mentioned it was important in your case to have a supportive partner, and then also you guys went down the path of de-risking by raising money, right? Like you ended up paying yourself out of investor dollars. Whereas Travis, I don't know if you guys have raised money. So I'd love to hear each of your thought processes on taking on investors, what that meant for the business, what that still means for the business, um, and the pros and cons there. So um, I don't have a strong opinion. Jannine, why don't you go? Because you just
Yeah,
shared
happy to.
it.
So we bootstrapped a bit at the beginning. And so it was myself, my co-founder, and we were trying to figure out what exactly we were building in the women's health space. And we decided that we were going to focus on telemedicine care delivery. So that was a very significant decision for the kind of capital we would need to raise or have and raise, because it requires a lot of upfront cash to hire clinicians and do all the things you need to do to be HIPAA compliant, for example. So that kind of made the decision for us in terms of like financing. And um, our angel investors are amazing and they remain amazing. And this is now like over 5 years ago. It is really tough. We're focused on the menopause space. At the time, no one was talking about menopause. It's now become like a much more mainstream topic in the health and wellness space. But it's, I mean, I could talk about this for a really long time, but like raising money as two female founders focused on women's health space that doesn't have any traction or even really recognition. The market is still like nascent if it exists at all. You're early, so you have no idea what you're doing. It was really, really tough. And it still is tough, honestly, to raise money because the investors typically, as is their job, are thinking about like, how am I going to get this capital returned to me and at what multiple? And if there aren't exits in your space to look to, if you can't be like, oh, well, we're following this trajectory of this comp, people just have to believe empirically like that the thing is going to work. And that's not really how these decisions are made. So I think it was, if I could start over, I would avoid it.
Mm.
But it was not, it wasn't really going to work that way. And so
Yeah,
it's tricky. Yeah, I think fundraising can be really, really tough.
absolutely. I'm curious for you to double click on that point, if you could do it again, you would avoid it. What makes you say that?
Well, I don't know how I would avoid it, like unless you kind of let's say you had a successful exit. I think we see this a lot, like in the founder community that I've gotten to know a little bit. The second time founders who had a successful exit and have some cash to bring means that they often either can set much better terms and they've just been through this before. So they like know what they don't know.
Yep.
But, the otherwise, you are really like at the mercy of
Yeah.
the investors you're bringing on. And we have been very lucky. And
Mhm.
still, it's very challenging to be on the like VC treadmill, um, because in our space, like things, sales in the healthcare space take forever. In many
Yeah.
spaces they do. So the sales cycle is really long, and yet you need to show proof points like pretty quickly to be able to get to the next level. And
Right.
so it's just, it's if there were a way to avoid it or reduce that impact on the day to day, like I would love that. But I don't, I think services businesses that are like as intensive as this, it's very hard to capitalize it otherwise.
Hmm. What is the impact on the day to day?
Yeah, I mean, you're sort of always worrying about that runway and the next raise, and you could spend all of your time as, CEO founder, like talking to investors, and then who's focused on running the business. So balancing that set of responsibilities against like kind of what Travis was saying about like running a business well. Am I like focusing on the fundamentals? Am I hiring well? Am I managing well? And I think it just is a huge time and effort suck that
Yeah.
um and stress and really stressful. So there's things that you can do yourself. I think I've gotten better at it over time. Like, but I haven't met a founder who's going through, raising venture money and is like, oh, that wasn't one of the, most terrific experiences of my professional life. So
Totally. Yeah, I've heard that a lot. And I do want to echo what you said about founders who are doing it for the second or third time. I also have seen the trend of either saying like, I'm just going to use my own money and build a business that doesn't need a bunch of capital up front because like I just don't want to deal with it. Or in the case of one of the companies that I worked at, Splice, Steve, the co-founder, had already sold a company, had plenty of money, and so he was able to get to basically not quite product market fit, but close before taking any outside capital. And so to your point, he really did control the destiny of the company in a completely different way than like what you're describing, which is like we weren't quite sure what was gonna work and we had to take money and so then it was like they were paying for us to figure it out versus we'd already figured it out and they're paying for us to grow it, you know?
yeah, I couldn't underscore that more. I'm sorry, Travis, I'm like hogging the mic, but the last thing I'll say is, and I think people said this to me early on, but it sounds so obvious, but it is the most important thing was who's going to pay for this? Like,
Mhm.
is there a business model? Will it make money? It doesn't matter how big of a problem it is, how impactful it feels to you as a person. The mission is so great. Like, if there is not a business model, this business will not work. And it sounds, I think when you're like optimistic or, passionate, you can like kind of make it work in your mind. And I think that we did struggle from a lot of that in the beginning, like trying to figure out what was the path, and it takes time. And then yeah.
Yeah.
So I think Steve is right on.
Thanks, Jannine. Travis, I'd love to hear your thinking about raising capital and what you all have decided and how that's played out.
Yeah, it's such an important question for, I mean, we could spend the rest of the time talking about this and it'd be worthwhile, I think, for everyone listening, because as I think about it, there's really like three options if you're going to be going this route. One is you bootstrap and you are the sole equity owner yourself, right? You've got some extra cash, or you've got a business that doesn't require a lot of cash and you can start getting cash flow going. Like that's probably the ideal if I had to choose a route. Um, the second is debt, right? So again, you still get to be the sole owner, or you and your partner continue to hold 100% of the ownership of the company, but now you have this burden of wow, okay, we have to make monthly payments on this, and that's going to affect our cash flow. And at the end of the day, if this business goes under, you've probably signed a personal guarantee or put up some collateral of your house or something like that. Like, okay, I got to go pay for this, even if the business is done and the doors are closed. It's a whole different sense of obligation and responsibility that some people do okay with, and other people do not like that. So it's kind of, again, depends on your sensitivity to debt and risk. And then the third way is let's get other people to inject equity, right? So I'm going to give up some ownership of the company, raise money from outside people who want to actually be owners. They're taking more risk, but now all of a sudden, as Jannine mentioned, I'm reporting to somebody totally different than I was in option number 1 and 2, and I'm having to move maybe at a very different pace than I would have under option 1 or 2 to try to prove something and to try to raise the next round. And so I witnessed this as the year I spent at Alliance of Angels. I kind of got the inside scoop looking at that, and I got to through some opportunities with business school, got to spend some time hanging out with venture capitalists in the Seattle area and just kind of understanding how they think and how they. And I was like, oh wow, okay, this is very, very cool and sexy, but it's not what I want, because I watched the founders, entrepreneurs that have to go nose to the grindstone 80 hours a week, just trying to go pedal to the metal for a few year sprint to get a very big payout. So my thinking, and I've got a 50% business partner and co-founder who actually had started our business model many years before I came along. We were both like, we want to do this for the lifestyle, and we don't want to have to be beholden to, meeting those milestones and taking venture funding. So we bootstrapped the company. Ours is a little different in that we had a working model. So my business partner, Drew, had started this company called Alaska Shore Tours. And, just the 30-second bit of what we actually do is we're a travel tech company. It's a booking platform like you might use Priceline or Expedia or one of those to book all your travel in one place, just that we do the fun stuff of travel, the tours, activities, excursions, no hotels or rental cars, just the things to do. And so he'd started this model in Alaska, and it was working really well. People, cruise passengers especially, but other folks would book all their excursions, and we get a cut of it and then send those bookings and the business along to the local tour operators. So we kind of had this tech platform fairly built out, the business model fairly built out. It was starting to make money. So we were able to use a lot of that existing momentum to have some confidence that, like, okay, we can do this now and grow it into a whole bunch more destinations. And we can grow it through this franchise model that we've chosen to take, which again requires less capital from us because franchisees are coming in to do some of the legwork, injecting a little bit of their own money and growing the markets as well. So that's, I guess, the final piece of how we were able to bootstrap it was, got some existing cash flow from this business that can help fund it, bringing in a little bit of our own cash and capital to fund it. And then the growth strategy is not one that's capital intensive of us doing all the work ourselves. It's let's pull in other people who can be a part of this thing together, and they can bring a little bit of cash to the table. So that being said, we did sort of see one good growth opportunity to kind of launch into the Caribbean. So we did raise a few $100,000 from friends and family. So that was the route we took. It was like, okay, friends and family will at least hopefully be sympathetic enough and patient enough that we don't have to get on the treadmill.
Mm-hmm. What are the downsides of bootstrapping, Travis?
Worrying about, cash at the end of the day. Like I think I'd probably be able to focus better at times if I, had a comfortable salary from funds that we had raised. I think smart people have given the advice of like, kind of don't be undercapitalized. And don't have to worry about your own day-to-day financial situation.
Yeah.
So you can focus 100% in on the business. And so one of the downsides of bootstrapping, and of course, back to optimistic projections, things take a little longer than expected for that cash flow to start funneling back in, is that then there's like a very real, like, okay, well, we can live, there's only so long you can live on savings, and you need to have like really strong cash coming in to do life and have kids and that want to go to college and things like that. So I think that's probably the biggest downside, is just the risk of being undercapitalized and maybe taking up some of your mental headspace. And then second, there's probably some problems that we could solve in our company right now that are just money problems. Like if we had 2 more people to do this stuff, it would free up a ton of time and energy. And so always having to think about, where's my time and energy best spent? If you don't have enough cash, it can be like, well, let's just get it done ourselves. Let's let's crank through it ourselves. When the the better strategic and bigger move would be hire that, get that off your plate, and focus on the important stuff. So those are probably the two big risks of bootstrapping that I've experienced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, Jannine, you've framed it like the venture treadmill, and you're always trying to, get to the next milestone to impress the investors. And I think, at the end of the day, the investors and you want the same thing most of the time, which is the company to grow and be successful. And so sometimes the accountability actually can motivate folks to achieve more, to push harder, and then they might if they're just accountable only to themselves. Um, I don't know. I'm
I
just
don't
throwing.
know. I don't know, only because, well, we did bootstrap for a little bit in the early days, but I mean, uh, you're so motivated. I don't know. I don't think that, it's like your time and your livelihood. And so I don't really, I've not really come across or felt myself a situation where you're like pushing harder because you have an external investor or board or something like that. That being said, I do think that I have two thoughts, and this is not recorded, right? So this is
Oh,
like,
it is recorded.
oh, it is recorded. Okay, well, right, I'll just um, thanks for letting me know. I mean, I think that it can be distracting. When you like go out and you are focusing on who else is fundraising, who else is in the space, like who's doing big rounds, big announcements.
Yep.
I think there's like a whole subculture around that can actually be distracting from the core of what you're doing. And so figuring out I mean, you have to participate, you have to know, of course, what your competitors in the landscape are doing, but I do think you have to really try to, or my world, like try not to over index on like splashy announcements and like what sounds, I think Travis, you mentioned this, like kind of, sexy venture investors and funds, and it can take up all of your time and headspace. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is, and this is like maybe less about entrepreneurship, like becoming a founder, but it feels relevant because I'm seeing it a lot in like my circle of friends. So I'm part of a women in tech group in New York. I both founders or co-founders or have worked for founding teams and been operators like, C-level at places like ZocDoc or JustWorks or Paperless Post, like a variety of different companies. And in the 40s, which is where most of these women are, who have, and this is a very gendered take, and you know, just like take it for what it is, but I'm seeing a ton of women who are like, I have kids, I have a crazy job, I am working nonstop for this like venture-backed company for like just fine pay and like a pretty crap lifestyle. I'm much more interested in like getting off that, even if you're not the founder yourself, like hearing people say they're interested in getting off of that, you know, like it tends to be described as like, white male investor driven culture, and do something different, like take my skills, all of my like skills that I've learned operating an early stage, and take them to somewhere else where I can be more in control of my own destiny. And so I don't know if that's just a small New York microcosm, but it definitely feels like I'm seeing a lot more of that. And I think some of those folks are like interested in maybe going more of the route of what Travis is describing.
Both of those
Absolutely.
things sounded so polite. I'm just now dying to know what Jannine was going to say if this meeting wasn't recorded.
We'll have a follow-up call off the record. I totally hear you, Jan. It's funny. I never thought about it this way, but there's almost this like inverse relationship between like your likelihood of success and your willingness to work really hard in a startup context. Like the more experience you get, the more wisdom you have, the more focus you have, like that's also when you're starting to deprioritize work, right? You're starting to prioritize family, prioritize yourself, prioritize other things. You're not really willing to work so hard. But of course, the expectations and the myths of the startup world are about grinding and working super hard. And like, yeah, we all did that in our 20s, but like we didn't know anything in our 20s, like so like yeah, that's an interesting
Productivity per hour or like
exactly.
different.
Let's do a little. So I saw a great question in the chat. Before we get to that, let's do a little bit of a lightning round. Um, just in terms of like what's the life of an entrepreneur like? So, the first one, and just like, yeah, maybe just one word, one sentence, something like that. What's the hardest part of being an entrepreneur?
I think one of the hardest things is there's nobody there to pat you on the back and tell you a good job. You're kind of out there and you have to remind yourself, like, I'm doing a good job and I'm giving this a lot. And uh, it can be, I have a business partner, which is helpful. A lot of times people are doing it solopreneurs, which I think would be really hard.
Yeah.
But yeah, just you don't get that same affirmation that you might in other kind of typical roles and from managers and people above you. It's like, okay, this is us. And we got to remind ourselves we're doing good work, and that can be challenging though without that affirmation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Travis. How about you, Jannine?
I think my one word answer would be fundraising and for, since the beginning. And then if I were to add a second, it would be now as like a mom with little kids, just figuring out how to, you know, like I work all the time and I travel a lot, and that is really tough. It's just hard to do both.
So balancing that life with, yeah. Hmm. Thanks.
I don't call it the balance, I call it the juggle.
The juggle. Nice. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I know. I saw you roll your eyes when I said balance, and I appreciate the clarification.
Yeah, just on that note, I mean, I think this is a common thing in entrepreneurship and a common challenge. You said juggling makes a lot of sense to me when you just kind of corrected to that. I like to use the analogy of spinning plates. So like we're both kind of doing circusy things, it sounds like, because there's so many different plates that you have to keep spinning, and choosing which one do I want to go back to or which one do I want to let fall. Like, if I'm juggling, like ultimately the things are going to fall and you have to let them and choose to reprioritize. And there's no end to it in terms of how much time you can spend. And finding that balance is an important piece of the journey for sure.
Absolutely. So now the flip side, what's the best part of being an entrepreneur? What do you think?
Well, I'll say something Jannine actually mentioned 15 minutes ago resonated a lot with me, and I think is one of the best parts is the ability to see things come to like something tangible come to fruition quickly. I was working in a world of big corporations, and yes, it's like, okay, we got to strategically position this to get the boss's boss on board, and then, get funding. And that, it just takes a long time, and there's a lot of, kind of winning opinions to get. Like now, it's like we want to do something, we're going to spend a day doing a quick analysis,
Mm-hmm.
and then we're going to decide to do it. And then the next week, the dev team is working on it, and 2 weeks later, like it's almost ready. Like, whoa, that's cool. And so getting to move quickly and then see like actual product come to life and see real users and seeing happy customers is a really fulfilling thing. I think it's just that's one thing I really enjoy.
Love
Yeah,
it.
I think that's so true. So happy patience in our case is the best. And my team is so great, even on the crappiest days. I feel just they're fun and they're funny and they're interesting. And like every time we do a non-work related thing, I learn something fascinating about one of them that, just feel very lucky to have that as in my every day.
That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing. Okay, the last question, and then we'll go to some audience questions. What do you wish you knew before you started that you know now?
Everything. I mean, I don't know. Like I went to business school and I'm like, what did I learn there? And I would love to go to business school now. I have like so many much more specific questions. It's like kind of a flip answer, but I'll think of something more specific.
Okay, Travis, you've had a little time to think. What do you think?
It's funny because if in many ways I don't, there's not one thing that jumps out to me. It was like, oh, if I only knew.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've sort of hammered on the point to be overly pessimistic in your projections and plan for the worst,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then be able to really aim for that top percentage of your potential expectations, right? So you kind of plan for the worst and but try to like knock it out of the park.
Mm-hmm.
But if I had known, I think something I've learned over the last few years, and again, learn this one in business school, but like you don't doesn't kind of like really get in your head until you do it or fail to do it, is just to really be data driven
Mm-hmm.
to help make your decisions. The last point I was making is you're going to have to focus on certain areas. You're going to have to let go of things. You're going to have to reprioritize. And it works a lot better if you truly use real data, real insights to make those decisions and kind of sometimes take your own desire to just go this way or that way on intuition. Like it's a total balance. You have to
Mm-hmm.
have the intuition, just like what feels right at a gut level, but it's
Mm-hmm.
also informed by the data. So that's something I, going back 4 or 5 years, would just continue to like get on that more earlier than I have now.
Travis, a follow-up, if I may, like what is there an example you can share of what you mean when you're like, I'd go back 4 or 5 years, I'd be doing that more consistently? Like, is it like looking at a dashboard more, or or what's on that dashboard? I'm just curious, like how you're thinking about it. 'Cause I struggle with this.
Yeah, I think, well, one of the downsides, I think, of not having the accountability of a board, an external board or something like that, is you don't have to kind of come back at the end of the month to say, okay, how did we actually do? What were our sales? What markets were the sales in? What was the actual return on our ad spend? And there's been times when like all of a sudden 6 months gone by and we realized that the return on ad spend was not where we needed it to be. And we just blew through, tens of thousands of dollars that we didn't need to blow through, which is a big deal when you're the size and scale that we're at. And so I think having more rigor around saying, okay, what are the like, handful of metrics? Like, doesn't need to be over the top, but like the handful of metrics that are going to help us do well. In our case, it might be return on ad spend or conversion rates or traffic and things like that. And diligently looking at them at every couple of weeks, at the end of the month, at the end of the quarter, whatever is the right rhythm. And then like sitting in those insights and saying, what do we do different now? What changes can we make? So I think it's really about identifying those key metrics early and the rigor of going back to them, even if there's nobody that's kind of like checking in on you.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense, and that example makes it really clear. I mean, the reason and I know this is, make it quick, but like the we always like had this sense of like, oh my gosh, we should be data driven, we should be metrics driven, but like sometimes we didn't really know what that meant. We were like tracking I mean, if the business is like, you're figuring it out and you don't know what you're tracking, then you're kind of tracking for the sake of tracking. And it, so it's, you're right. And we do that more. And I've been in situations where I'm like, we could just come up with data for anything and like, using it, like having it's sort of collecting it. And then I think what the second part of what you said, like using it and being like, what does this mean to us? What are we going to do with it? And making sure you're spending that time on it as opposed to just like, yeah, we collect it. And of course, like it's there. And, um,
Absolutely. And what I'm hearing from Travis is having like an external perspective and like an outsider's eyes that's not seeing all the day-to-day minutia. They're just seeing those headline numbers that you've all agreed are important. Helps to really focus the mind on like, okay, what's actually happening here and what's working and what's not working. Because when you're in the day-to-day of it, you know all the little reasons and all the nuances why you made these little micro decisions, right? But then at the end of the day, it does add up to these high level, outcomes, and having the conversations about those high level outcomes helps with that prioritization. Which plates should I let drop? Yeah. Jannine, do you wanna take a crack at what do you wish you knew back then? I've got a couple good
Yeah, I
questions.
think like really quickly sales. I just think that sales is a hugely valuable skill set
Yep.
that I'm like, why in all my years of doing various things did like I not learn how to really do this properly or well,
Yep.
um, or ever, so that it's probably that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's such a valuable skill set. Okay, I'm gonna jump to the chat. Melissa's asked a question. I don't know if you saw it. Can either of you share a bit about the support you had through the entrepreneurial journey? What helped the most? So, either one of you or both, feel free. And I'd love to get to the two other questions that we've got in the chat as well. So, just in terms of the time context, let's keep that in mind.
I'm happy to say, I had a co-founder. She's still a co-founder, but she's no longer in the business. But we, started from this point of like really equal partnership. And I think that was huge. And we've been through so much together. And we're very lucky in New York to be part of a number of like this startup ecosystem is really robust. There's a lot of different groups and communities. And one of the things that's good about being in some of these, having these early stage investors, they do tend to bring their portfolio companies together. And some of those friendships I've made have been are like transcend work, are just really awesome people that I'm lucky to have in my life. And then really quickly on the second piece, I think that working in women's health and female founders, again, lucky in New York to have a concentration of other founders that are navigating similar stuff with their like trying to explain menopause to a 20 something, early stage male investor associate. It's like sometimes you just need to have
Yep.
a group of folks that you can call and be like, oh my God, like how did you do that? Or, what did you not do? Or, I think that really helps.
Yep. Absolutely. Travis, what about you?
Yeah, I'll say just a couple quick things. One that maybe is a little out of the ordinary is got into this business because I was working at a co-working space. That's how I met my founder, and I continue to work. That's where I'm at now. And it's not direct support to the day-to-day business, but it's the ability to go out and rub shoulders and talk with people and hang out and just go
Yep.
for a bike ride over lunch or something like that is actually so important. I think if I were to have done this whole thing over again, all working from home by myself, I wouldn't still be here.
Mm,
For what it's worth, like that's been a really interesting and valuable support system for me. Is just like the people that know about what I do and can bounce ideas off of the handful of folks who might have some specific insight that I need. Um,
and just the
so
feeling of not being alone in the
that
struggle. Yeah.
even more important than like all of a sudden like, oh, I've built my network now. It's more like, no, I just have people to hang out with in amidst this
Yep.
slog.
Yep.
Because it's hard work oftentimes. And then the other thing is just having, in my case, a business partner is super helpful. And I think some of the best times that where I feel supported and we kind of get some rejuvenation, more energy is not just in the day to day, but we'll go and like take an afternoon a couple times a year and just like hop on the river in our raft and go like float down the river and hang out and get out of the office and just can kind of step back and talk about like, how you feeling? Are we marching in the right direction still? We feeling good? Like those high level questions is super helpful. So having a business partner or someone who's close enough that knows your problems to be able to get out and kind of a perspective check is super helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you. Quentin asked this question. I leapt into entrepreneurship, but I'm rethinking the approach from startup business acquisitions. Can either of you speak about any experience or thoughts you've had about acquisition entrepreneurship? Some people call this entrepreneurship through acquisition, ETA. Any thoughts? It sounds like Travis, you were more kind of like starting down that path. Maybe you can share your perspective on that.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a really, they're both entrepreneurship to me, whether you start your own company or you buy an existing one. It's like you're running a business on your own and
Yep.
solving challenges and being your own boss. And so
Yep.
the acquisition one to me is it has a lot of appealing aspects to it just because the energy is so much less about like hey, product market fit, will this work? Can we get
Yeah.
customers? It's like, hey, there's a business and you can see it working and unfolding, and ask questions to the existing customers and the owners and to the employees. There's a lot less risk in that. And that all becomes about sort of running the numbers. Does it work? Right?
Hmm.
If I need to buy this and I need to finance half of it with debt, can I really easily make those cash payments? And do I see opportunity to add value and grow this to become something bigger than what it is? And what are those ideas? And why have they not worked before? Why did the
Yeah.
previous owner not do them? So that's shifts
Mhm.
the kind of what your focus is on in that realm versus so it's probably a lower risk thing it can still be a great payout financial reward, but it's not going to be the big one, versus if you're going into this world of like starting something from scratch that's potentially going to be a huge idea and you're taking VC money, like a lot bigger risk. And so a lot bigger chance you're going to fail. And if you do make it through, there's a really, really sweet payout at the end of it. And you're probably doing something that's a little bit more revolutionary, like Jannine is
Mhm.
doing, than, had I gone in and just bought like a property management company or a landscaping company or something like that. It's, known business, and there's maybe a little less excitement to power you in that. If so, it kind of depends on what you're excited by.
Yeah.
I have one observation, which is I see a lot of early stage companies. I do like a lot of mentoring of pre-seed and early stage startups, and a lot of them have built something great and just like can't find the business model, can't raise more money. I think there are actually like a lot of really, really great early stage startups that are very interested in like being acquired for almost nothing and have a germ or a seed to be able to coax into something else. A lot of them just go out of business, and I don't know how to I'm sure someone is figuring out like how to like find them and create a list or community or whatever, but I think it's not crazy to think about who has like put some of the startup effort into it and just like hasn't cracked it but has still made some progress that could be acquired
Mhm.
as an asset.
Yeah, I've always thought about that possibility, Jannine. I've talked to some folks. I think there's some structural barriers, but I still think it's an interesting opportunity. Quentin, I'd love to talk with you more about that offline. That's a very interesting question, and I've been spending some time thinking about that as well. Let's quickly address Dylan's question. So do you think the mystique of entrepreneurship brings a lot of people that maybe aren't really entrepreneurs into the ring? Um, and maybe that's kind of like they're doomed to from the start just because they're not cut out for it.
I don't know the answer to this. I think that in all realms, they're, like it's maybe, but I think that it's probably more, in my experience that, people have energy and passion or personal experience, and that motivates them. And then either they like get there, they figure it out, they do the learning, or they don't. But I don't know that it matters so much that, what brought them in the first place, like what part of that.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe a different way to ask the question is like, is there a special entrepreneurship skill that's different from selling or building products or, being a technical person or marketing, like this unique thing that is like this entrepreneurial skill? And should we be trying to kind of like develop that?
I I can answer that. I think there's two things that come to mind. One is grit. Like you hear about this of people like it's going to be hard and you kind of want to give up, but you're just going to keep going. And because most
Mhm.
people quit too soon, and that's why they don't reach the payout. And then the second is just adaptability. Like things, what you thought was going to be, it will not be the case.
Yep.
Can you change and try something different? Can you rework? So like those two things, grit and adaptability, I don't think it matters the level of education you have coming in, the level of
Right.
skills you do or don't have. Like you're going to learn them if you have those two things.
Yeah.
What people oftentimes I think happens is people believe it's sort of this, yeah, the sexy idea, and they're not going to have to work that hard.
Right.
Even coming into a franchise, they're like, oh, somebody else has figured this out for me. They're going to do all the work, you know? And so if you don't think you're going to have to work very hard, entrepreneurship is probably not a great path.
That's actually a perfect place to end the call. So thank you. Thank you, Jannine. This was a wonderful conversation. Let's give them a round of applause. And
Thank
you know,
you.
don't be strangers. All of you on the call, send a follow-up and share the recording. Jannine luckily was very polite. So there's nothing bad on the recording. But it
Thank
was
you
a pleasure. Yeah. Thanks so
thanks
much.
for having us and the
And I'll say
invite.
I'm happy if anybody's still on the call to want to reach out on LinkedIn or whatever. I'm more than happy to have one-on-one chats and share life and experiences. This is fun stuff. So really, Ginny, it was great getting to chat with you, and Andrew, thanks for facilitating.
Of course. Yeah, it was a pleasure. Have a
Sure,
great day,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye. All right. See you later. I'm going to jump to my next call. Bye.